Another thing I'd like to say on this topic, it's a little similar. When you buy a cigar from a retailer out of his humidor, almost always those cigars are always a little too wet, in my opinion. And the reason why they're wet is because most humidors, they have environmental controls that every time someone opens the door, they click on. So the cigars are constantly getting extra humidity. It shuts off. Somebody walks in the humidor, clicks back on. And, that happens, 20, 30, 40, 50 times a day. So oftentimes when you buy a cigar from a retailer that's in a box, particularly one that's opened, okay, and is on the shelf and you're pulling out singles, in my opinion, almost always those cigars are a little too wet. And the other thing too is the old adage of that whole 70% relative humidity, that was kind of developed in a time when all pretty much of what people were smoking were much milder cigars. They were smoking cigars that were made out of much thinner materials, whether they be Cuban or whether they be Dominican. Okay. So those cigars can be smoked a little wetter because their tobaccos don't hold the moisture the same way as the heavier cigars do. But as you start to smoke more Central American cigars with a lot of Nicaraguan and Honduran style fillers in them, those leaves are much thicker, and just the hydroscopic, and I don't even know what the word in Portuguese is for hydroscopic. What is that word? Because I'm curious now. Hydroscopic basically means it takes on the characteristics of the environment in which it's in. So what'll end up happening is these cigars will become too wet. Most fuller bodied, richer, more robust style cigars, they simply smoke better drier. You're much better off at a 65% relative humidity than you are at a 70% relative humidity. Now, if you're like most of us, you can't do that, right? Because you have both mild cigars and thinner cigars in your humidor, thinner materials. I'm not talking about thinner ring gauge, and you have heavier cigars. So like my personal humidor, my walk-in humidor at home, I keep it right around 66 to 67 because I tend to smoke more heavier style cigars, and I find that to be better. But a lot of times a consumer is better served just taking the cigar out of the cellophane and leaving it on the table overnight, and just giving it a chance to dry a little bit, particularly when you start talking about smoking the heavier Nicaraguan style products that we manufacture today.
Uau, fantástico. Então, o umidor do Steve Saka, ele vai de 65% até 67%, 68%. E a temperatura é importante ou não?
Temperature is really not all that important. I know that we make a big deal out of it, but it really isn't. You have to understand, cigars are made, look, these factories where we make these cigars, it's 85 to 95 degrees all of the time. The biggest thing that you as a consumer have to worry about temperature-wise is you have seen these charts where it says if it's this temperature, you should use this relative humidity. Ignore those. It's nonsense. It's psychobabble, okay? And just common sense and experience will get you out of that. But when the tobaccos are warmer, they do tend to be a little bit more pliable. They do tend to be a little spongier, okay? So to keep a cigar set well, a cigar stays set well between between really 50 degrees and 70 degrees, 75 degrees. When you get over 75, the tobaccos get a little more pliable, and it doesn't quite burn or smoke the same way, but it isn't a problem. The biggest concern that you have is that the higher you get up the temperature gauge, the more likely you are to get tobacco beetles. And that range between like 82 to about 92 degrees is about the worst. That's like almost the ideal temperature. Now, this isn't as big of an issue today as it used to be because we as manufacturers are much better at our fumigation. We're using much better applications of chemicals than we used to use. We're much more diligent about it. We also now have incorporated freezing of almost all the products, almost every manufacturer at this point, with the exception of some of the really small little Fabriquita Chinchillas type places. They all have a way to freeze before they ship. So we as consumers today do not have the tobacco risk that the consumers had even in the 80s or 90s. And anybody that smoked a lot of cigars back in the 90s will remember that this was a very regular problem that we as cigar smokers had to deal with, but it's become a much less of a problem today. In fact, I think most consumers today, they've never even seen a tobacco beetle. They don't even know what a borehole looks like. They have no experience with it at all, where if you were a cigar smoker back in 1993, we all knew what beetles looked like. We all had to deal with them. It was a problem for everybody. It's not as big of a problem. So temperature isn't really as sensitive. I think the most important thing, I think too many consumers, they get too caught up in anal about the humidity and the temperature. It's really not so much that. Your cigar is probably going to be fine anywhere from 60 to 70% relative humidity. Your cigar is going to be fine anywhere from like 45 degrees up to 90 degrees, higher risk, obviously, of beetles as you get up in the scale. The most important thing is actually for it to just be stable. A stable environment is the best environment, because when you constantly have huge temperature shifts and you have huge humidity shifts, that cigar is constantly expanding, contracting, expanding, contracting. And what ends up happening is it ends up weakening the binder. It ends up causing problems with the wrappers that'll end up cracking. And even though it may not crack in the box, it'll crack when you go to light it, because that cigar has been expanding, contracting, expanding, contracting, expanding, contracting. And in the worst case scenario, you can actually see cigars, they'll get almost crinkle. You'll see almost a wrinkle in the cigar from that constant up, down, up, down. So I think the more important thing is to just find a place where you're stable and you're happy. And the other thing too is to not, and so many of these relative humidity gauges that we as consumers use, they just suck. I mean, you're lucky if they're plus or minus 5%. You know what I mean? So I think one of the things that I would recommend to the consumer is spend a little money, buy a Boveda pack. They're very accurate. Pick the one that's 67 or 70. Throw it in a Ziploc baggie for a day or so with your humidity gauge and see what the humidity gauge actually reads. So then it kind of gives you a benchmark. Okay, the pack is 67, but this gauge reads 72. All right, I know it's reading 5 too high. You know what I mean? And to try to get a sense of that. And what you will find over time is you almost don't need it anymore. You could just tell by how it feels and how it smokes. And just, you know, it's one of these things that when we're new, we really just way overanalyze. And then when you get to be old like me, I leave cigars on the desk. I leave them in the truck. I've got them. You know what I mean? You get much. It's like when you have the first baby. You're worried about everything it puts in its mouth and everything it touches. And by the time you're the fourth child, that child's feral. He's on his own. He can stick anything in his mouth. He tumbles down the stairs. He'll be fine. You know what I mean? You get less angst-ridden about it over time.
Perfeito, perfeito. Então, gente, resumindo a obra toda aqui, diretor, fuma! Fuma! Se preocupa em experimentar, em conhecer as coisas, que é muito mais interessante.
Sim.